Your parents bought a house at 25 on a single income. You can't afford rent at 30 with 2 jobs. And somehow, people still say you're just bad with money. Home prices up 400% since 1980. Wages up 50%. Average student debt sitting at $37,000. And here's the one that stops me cold every time. Boomers owned 21% of all U.S. wealth when they were 35 millennials. At the same age, 4.6%. Same country, same economy. Wildly different result. So let me ask you the question. This whole video is built around, was the game rigged before you even started playing? Hit subscribe if you want to keep running the real math, because that's exactly what we're doing today. Let's start at the beginning. Every generation looks at the next one and sees laziness. That is not new. That is just what humans do. But here's the thing. Usually, it's just perception. This time, the numbers tell a different story. In 1975, the advice was simple. Work hard, get a job, save a little, buy a house, retire. And it worked. Not because the people following that advice were smarter or more disciplined than you. It worked because the economic structure underneath that advice was built to support it. Wages rose with productivity. Housing was accessible. A degree cost what a summer job could cover. The floor was solid. Then the floor moved. There's a chart economists call the scissors graph. It shows wages and cost of living starting together, easing together, and then sometime in the mid-70s, they cross. Wages flatten costs, keep climbing. The scissors open, and they never close back up. That crossing point is not a blip. It's the entire story of every financial struggle you've had since the moment you started adult. Here's a number that makes it concrete. $1 in 1970 has the purchasing power of roughly $8 today. So if wages had simply kept pace with inflation, just kept pace, not even outrun it, the median full-time worker in America would be earning somewhere north of $90,000 a year. Most aren't. Not even close. The math doesn't lie. The system just stopped passing the gains down. Now put two people side by side. A boomer at 30 in 1985 probably owns a starter home. Minimal debt, maybe some savings. Pension building quietly at work. A millennial at 30 in 2018, renting, carrying student loans, no pension, a 401k. They were told to figure out themselves, and a net worth that is, on average, significantly below zero. Same age, same ambition, completely different economic gravity. And this is before we even get to the thing. Nobody warned them about the debt they took on just to qualify for a job. Which brings us to the second layer, college and what happened to it. In the early 1970s, a year at a public university cost roughly $400 in tuition. A student working a summer job, minimum wage, nothing special could cover it. The deal was real. Go to school, get a degree, earn more for life. The math worked because the price of entry was proportional to what the entry actually got you. Then the price of entry got redesigned. Tuition at public universities has risen over 1,200% since 1980 after inflation. Healthcare is up about 600%. Housing, as we said, over 400%, and wages, 50%. The cost of gaining access to the middle class outran the rewards of reaching it, and nobody changed the promise. The billboard still said, degree equals a good life. The fine print just quietly changed underneath it. So millions of people did exactly what they were told. They borrowed, they showed up, they graduated, and they walked into a job market where degree-acquired positions were regularly paying $40,000 a year. The math that was supposed to work did not work. Here's what makes student debt different from other debt. It doesn't just cost you money. It costs you time in the most compounding, irreversible sense of that word. Every year you're paying off student loans is a year you're not building a down payment. Every year you're not building a down payment is a year you're not owning a home. Every year you're not owning a home, someone else's asset is appreciating while yours isn't. The delay compounds. And the cruelty of it is that the people who needed the degree the most, the ones without wealthy parents, without safety nets, without family connections to fall back on, are the ones who borrowed the most to get it. Total student debt in the United States right now sits at approximately $1.7 trillion. That is more than all credit card debt in the country combined. More, that number is not an accident. It is the result of a system where the price of the toll booth got raised after everyone was already on the highway, and there was no exit ramp back. Now, let's talk about the thing that might be making you the most frustrated in your daily life. Housing. In 1980, the median home in America cost roughly 3 times the median household income. 3 times. If you made $50,000, you were shopping for a $150,000 house. The numbers were in the same universe. Today, that ratio in most American cities sits between 7 and 10 times income. In cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, you're talking 15 to 20 times. Same math. Completely different answer. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. This didn't just happen because of supply and demand in some neutral, invisible hand kind of way. Institutional investors, Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and others began buying single-family homes by the thousands in the years following the 2008 crash. Homes that families would have purchased, converted into rental properties, held permanently, removing them from the ownership market entirely. Between 2011 and 2017, institutional investors purchased approximately 200,000 single-family homes in the United States. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural removal of inventory from people who are trying to build equity. Add the Airbnb effect. Hundreds of thousands of properties in desirable cities converted from long-term housing into short-term income assets. A home that used to shelter a family now shelters tourists for 3 nights at a time and generates more revenue for the owner. Less housing for people who need it to live. More housing for people who need it to profit. And then there's zoning. Municipalities across the country have zoning laws written and maintained largely by homeowners. Peo pligus. Primary financial interest is in keeping home values high. Restricting new supply keeps prices up. So construction is blocked, density is forbidden, and the shortage is protected by policy. That's not an accident. That's a constituency protecting its asset. Here's the cruelest math of all of this. In many American cities right now, the monthly cost of renting a 2-bedroom apartment is higher than what the mortgage payment would be on that same apartment if you could buy it. But you can't get the mortgage without a down payment. And you can't save the down payment while you're paying rent. That already costs more than a mortgage would. The trap is geometrically perfect. Renting makes buying impossible, and the impossibility of buying keeps you renting. So they can't own where they live. Can they at least build wealth another way? Here's where the story gets even harder to hear. The stock market over the last decade has tripled in value. By almost any measure, the last 10 to 15 years have been extraordinary for wealth building through equities. But here's the thing. Nobody mentions after they show you that chart, approximately 90% of all stocks in the United States are owned by the wealthiest 10% of households. The market tripled. The gains went somewhere very specific. And it's not just stocks. Look at how work itself changed. The gig economy was sold as freedom, flexibility. Be your own boss. What it actually delivered for most people was no employer-funded health insurance, no retirement contributions, new paid leave, no job security, and the full burden of self-employment taxes. The flexibility was real. The freedom was largely marketing. Then there's the pension shift. And this one matters more than most people realize. Boomers, as a generation, largely entered the workforce during the era of defined benefit pensions. You worked for a company for 30 years, and they paid you a monthly check for the rest of your life. Guaranteed income. Guaranteed stability. The risk was on the employer. Millennials inherited a different system, the 401k, a defined contribution plan, where the risk is entirely on the employee. The outcomes are entirely dependent on your ability to invest correctly over decades, and the company's obligation ends the moment they make a matching contribution. Boomers got a promise. Millennials got a password to a Fidelity account and a pamphlet explaining compound interest. And inflation, that became impossible to avoid. Starting in 2021, hits different when you're young. Because inflation doesn't hit everything equally. It hits hardest on the things that young people cannot avoid spending money on: rent, healthcare, education, food. The things that consume the largest share of a young person's income are exactly the categories where price increases have been the most severe and the most sustained. Then there's the inheritance gap. This one operates quietly, which is why it doesn't get the attention it deserves. A 25-year-old whose parents can provide a down payment doesn't just get a house earlier. They get decades of equity building that their peers, same job, same income, same discipline, cannot replicate no matter how hard they try. The gap between someone who inherited a financial head start and someone who didn't is not a motivation gap. It is a structural, compounding, mathematically insurmountable gap that grows wider every year. And it's almost never discussed in personal finance content because personal finance content is built around the fiction that individual choices are the primary variable. Now let's talk about Gen Z. Because if millennials had it hard, Gen Z walked into the same room with the furniture rearranged and the exits harder to find. Gen Z entered the job market at one of the most structurally turbulent moments in modern economic history. A global pandemic. The fastest AI disruption of white-collar work in recorded history. A credential inflation spiral where a bachelor's degree now competes for jobs that previously required a high school diploma, pushing everyone up the education ladder and further into debt. The entry point keeps moving. The cost of reaching, it keeps rising. And then there's what nobody's measuring well yet, the psychological cost. Researchers studying financial stress and mental health in young adults have documented something that older generations didn't face in the same way. The constant, inescapable visibility of other people's apparent wealth. Social media has turned comparison into a full-time ambient experience. Every day, algorithmically curated images of people your age who appear to be living the life the system promised you. It doesn't matter that most of it is performance. Chronic comparison to idealized images has documented effects on financial decision-making, on risk tolerance, on self-worth, on spending behavior. The psychological tax is real, and it lands on top of every other structural burden this generation is already carrying. Remote work seemed like it might finally be the break work from anywhere, access big city salaries without big city costs, and for some people, it genuinely was. But for most, the cost of living in places where remote tech jobs cluster has followed demand upward. The gap between what you earn and what it costs to live reasonably is not dramatically better than before. The trap has a new shape. And then there's the climate dimension, the one that economic analysis almost never includes. Gen Z is entering peak earning and asset building years at the exact moment the climate-related costs are beginning to structurally reprice real estate, insurance, and regional livability. Flood insurance in coastal areas, wildfire insurance in the West, growing lists of zip codes being declared effectively uninsurable by major carriers. The assets their parents told them to build toward are becoming harder to insure, harder to sell, and in some cases, physically dangerous to inhabit. This is not hyperbole. This is what the insurance industry's own data is already showing. So who actually benefits from all of this? Here's the thing, and I want you to hear this clearly, because it changes how you see the whole picture. These are not accidents. They are not unfortunate side effects of an otherwise well-designed system. They are policy outcomes. Every single structural barrier we've talked about in this video has identifiable winners, identifiable political constituencies, and identifiable lobbying efforts defending it. High home prices benefit homeowners. Homeowners vote at extraordinarily high rates. Politicians who protect zoning laws that restrict new housing supply are protecting their most reliable constituency. That's not a conspiracy. That's just the electoral math. The tax code treats capital gains profits from investments at a lower rate than wages. Money that works gets taxed less than people who work. This is deliberate policy. Wealth compounds faster when it's taxed less. Labor cannot compound. The gap between the two is not closing. Student loan services have spent tens of millions of dollars lobbying against debt relief and against regulatory reform of lending practices. Private equity firms have spent comparable sums opposing regulations that would limit their ability to purchase single-family homes in bulk. These industries exist at the precise intersection of policies that make life harder for young people and money that flows to people who are already wealthy. That's not accidental either. And then there is the $84 trillion generational wealth transfer currently underway, the largest in human history. As boomers age and pass their accumulated assets to their children, the recipients of that transfer will be overwhelmingly the children of people who are already wealthy. The people who need it most will receive the least of it. Effort and inheritance are not the same variable, but in the wealth conversation, they are constantly conflated. The system isn't broken. That's the hard thing to accept. It's working exactly as designed. The design just wasn't made for you. So are Millennials and Gen Z doomed? No. But the answer is not going to be found in the same playbook that built the previous generation's wealth. And the sooner that's accepted, the faster the real path becomes visible. On an individual level, there are moves that actually change the math. Geographic arbitrage, deliberately choosing where you live based on the ratio of your remote income to local cost of living, can compress a decade of savings into 3 years for the right person in the right situation. Skills over credentials in fields where output is measurable and remote work is viable can sidestep the degree debt spiral entirely. Housejacking, purchasing a multi-unit property and living in one unit while renting the others, is one of the oldest wealth-building strategies that still works, and it's experiencing a quiet revival among people who figured out the traditional path is closed. These are not magic. They are structural workarounds for a system that wasn't built to help you. They work precisely because most people don't use them. But here's what individual optimization cannot do. It cannot change the tax code. It cannot rezone cities. It cannot regulate institutional purchasing of single-family homes. It cannot restructure student loan interest. Only collective action can do those things. And here's where the generational math actually starts to work in your favor for the first time. Millennials and Gen Z together now constitute the largest voting bloc in the United States. Larger than boomers, larger than Gen X. The political power is there. The question is whether it gets organized around the specific policy changes that would actually move the needle. Housing supply reform, capital gains, tax equity, student loan system restructuring, pension equivalent retirement security for gig workers. These are not radical ideas. They are documented policies implemented in peer countries that have produced measurably better outcomes for young adults. They are achievable. They require political will that is directly proportional to turnout. The mindset shift required is this: stop trying to replicate the boomer path. It is not available. The house in the suburbs at 28 on a single income, that version of the American dream has a price tag that the current economy does not support for most people. Grieving that is legitimate, but staying in that grief is expensive. The people who are building real wealth right now in this generation are not doing it by trying harder at the old strategy. They are building it by accepting the new terrain and navigating accordingly. Skills that compound, income streams that don't depend on a single employer, assets acquired creatively, communities built around shared financial education rather than financial competition. So, was the game rigged? Yes. Structurally, historically, documentably, yes. But here's what they didn't count on: a generation that finally stopped blaming themselves and started reading the rule book. Home prices that outran wages by a factor of 8 to 1. Student debt that became a life sentence for the price of a career qualification. A housing market structurally closed to first-time buyers by policy and institutional capital. Wealth gains that went almost entirely to people who were already wealthy. And a tax code that rewards owning things more than doing things. 5 forces, all documented. None of them your fault. If you've been working hard and following the rules and still feeling like you're falling behind, you are not imagining it. The math was working against you before you made a single decision. That is not an excuse to stop. It is a reason to stop blaming yourself, start seeing the actual landscape, and start making moves that are built for the world as it actually is. Not the world it used to be. If this video said out loud something you've felt for years but couldn't quite put into words, share it. Because the first step to changing a game is proving the game exists. Drop a like if this helped, and stay with Haas. Because next, we're getting into what actually builds wealth when you start with nothing. Not theory. The specific moves in order with the math to back them up.